Hi everyone, welcome to this video. The objective of this presentation is to share with you all you need to know about greenhouse gas emissions and specifically about the greenhouse gas protocols standards for accounting for these emissions, which are segmented into Scope 1, 2, and 3. The structure of the presentation will be as follows. First, I'll give you a brief introduction of the common types of greenhouse gases and where they might commonly come from. Next, I will go on to introduce the three scopes and how greenhouse gas emissions from your company should be accounted for. Lastly, I will contextualize the emissions accounting process with a product I hope you all are familiar with, potato chips. So without further ado, let's get started. The gases here are the four more common gases produced by companies all over the world, namely carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and synthetic gases. As you can see, they have different GWP values. GWP stands for global warming potential, which is a measure of how much heat each gas traps within a specified period of time relative to carbon dioxide. This would mean that nitrous oxide traps 25 times more heat in the atmosphere than carbon dioxide for the same period of time. Carbon dioxide emissions contributes a hefty 81% of the world's greenhouse gases and is the main contributor to climate change, with methane and nitrous oxide coming in second and third place respectively. The main source of carbon dioxide emissions arises from the combustion of fossil fuels, while methane is produced naturally when vegetation is burnt, digested, or rotted in the absence of oxygen, and nitrous oxides are commonly released into the atmosphere via chemical fertilizers. As you can see, the release of almost all greenhouse gases are due to human activity and are a huge concern. Next, I want to introduce the three scopes of emissions determined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to help companies account for their greenhouse gas emissions. Scope 1 deals with the direct greenhouse gas emissions that occur from sources owned or controlled by the company. Owned or controlled being the imperative phrase here. Emissions under Scope 2 are emissions that are generated from purchased electricity consumed by the company, occurring physically at the facility where the electricity is generated, which refers to electricity we use for lights, air conditioning, or to power our desktops at home. Scope 3, the only optional category to report, refers to indirect greenhouse gas emissions from the activities of a company occurring at sources not owned or controlled by the company. This time, pay attention to the phrase not owned or controlled by the company. Scope 3 typically makes up 90% of a company's total emissions. In order to determine which activities or processes are owned or controlled by the company, organizational boundaries have to be defined. There are two approaches to define these boundaries. The equity share approach, which accounts for emissions according to the share of equity in said operation, or the control approach, which accounts for emissions from operations which the company has control over. Control can further be subdivided into financial control, which looks at whether or not the company has the ability to direct financial and operational policies with a view to gain economic benefits from said activity, or operational control, which considers emissions if the parent company or one of its subsidiaries has full authority to introduce and implement operating policies for the operation. After understanding the reporting boundaries for your company, you need to understand the general calculations used to calculate the greenhouse gas emissions from your activities, which is shown by the equation made up of activity data, an emission factor, and the GWP factor. Activity data is a measure of a level of activity that results in GHG emissions, like the amount of fuel consumed while driving, while an emission factor is one that is used to convert activity data into emissions data, which sometimes takes the units of CO2 per liter of fuel burnt. Lastly, for emissions other than CO2, a GWP factor has to be applied so that the GHG emissions can be compared on an even level. To help you understand the process better, I will attempt to contextualize it with a bag of potato chips. Welcome to the journey to the belly of a customer, the story of a pack of fried potato chips. We can break down the life cycle of a bag of potato chips into 3 segments. Firstly, the upstream segment, which involves the sourcing and processing of raw materials required to make potato chips, as well as its packaging. Emissions produced under the upstream segment are typically classified under Scope 3 because of its indirect contribution. Next, the actual production of the potato chips, which involve cutting, frying of potatoes, with machines that might run on electricity or fossil fuels. These emissions are classified under Scope 1 and 2. Lastly, the downstream segment of a potato chip's life cycle, which involves the distribution and storage, consumption, and disposal at end of life, which are indirect and accounted for under the Scope 3 category. Next, I want to elaborate more on what each scope entails and which activities they include. In general, there are 4 main sources of emissions which contribute to Scope 1 emissions. These are the generation of electricity, heat, or steam from stationary sources, physical or chemical processing, transport of materials, products, waste, and employees, and fugitive emissions. As you can imagine, machinery in a potato chip factory might involve all of these actions, with the heat and chemicals required to cook the potatoes, transportation of unfinished products from one area to another using vehicles, and fugitive emissions from air conditioning units. Emissions from the electricity consumed by the company during the production of these potato chips are accounted for under Scope 2. Generally, emissions under this category are calculated by multiplying the amount of electricity consumed by an emission factor, which can vary depending on which method your company chooses to adopt. The 2 types of emission factors include site-specific, which refer to the emissions of a specific power plant, and averages, which take an average of the emissions from all the power generated within a geographical boundary. The decision on which emission factor to use may arise due to fuel mix of specific power producers that might be less polluting than the average of the region you are operating in, and this could severely impact your Scope 2 emissions. Indirect emissions from a company are accounted for under Scope 3, which is then subdivided into 15 different categories, each with their slight nuances in their calculations. You can see that they are also divided into 8 upstream and 7 downstream categories. In order to get a better grasp of Scope 3 emission categories, I will stick with potato chip production in order to contextualize certain categories. Category 1 accounts for emissions associated with purchased goods and services, which are defined as the extraction, production, and transportation of goods and services purchased by the reporting company. In the case of potato chips, this includes the emissions associated with planting the potatoes or the production of the cooking oil, packaging materials, and additives required. Category 2 accounts for the emissions associated with capital goods acquired by the reporting company and is defined as the extraction, production, and transportation of capital goods purchased by the reporting company. An example of this would be all the emissions associated with producing the cutting and frying machines. Category 3 accounts for fuel and energy-related activities and is defined as the extraction, production, and transportation of fuels and energy purchased by the reporting company. An example of this would be the fuel required to operate the cutting or frying machines. A point to note when calculating Category 3 emissions is that the emission factors used should exclude the actual combustion of the fuel, which belong under Scope 1, and should only include the emissions produced when harvesting said fuels. Category 4 accounts for emissions produced during upstream transportation and distribution, which is defined as transportation and distribution of products purchased by the reporting company by vehicles not owned or controlled by the company, since transportation and distribution of products by vehicles owned by the company belong under Scope 1. Some examples include the delivery of raw materials by a supplier with the supplier's vehicles. Category 5 accounts for emissions produced from waste generated in operations, which is defined as emissions from the disposal and subsequent treatment of waste generated by the reporting company and facilities not owned or controlled by the company. An example of this would be the waste treatment and disposal of frying oil, which is outsourced to a third party. Category 6 accounts for emissions from business travel, defined as transportation of employees for business-related activities in vehicles not owned or controlled by the reporting company. Such travel includes international travel on planes or cross-country travel on trains for work-related activities like meetings or attending conferences. Category 7 accounts for employee commuting, defined as the transportation of employees between their homes and work sites in vehicles not owned or operated by the reporting company. Such commuting includes the emissions produced by buses or trains which employees take to work. Category 8 accounts for emissions from upstream leased assets, which is defined as emissions from the operation of assets leased by the reporting company not previously included in Scope 1 or Scope 2. An example of this would be the emissions associated with the use of leased office space or rental cars used for business. Moving on to downstream, the first downstream category accounts for emissions from downstream transport and distribution, which is defined as transportation and distribution of products sold by the reporting company in vehicles not owned or controlled by the company. This includes transportation of the finished product from warehouses to retail stores in vehicles which do not belong to the reporting company. Category 2 accounts for emissions from the processing of sold products, which are defined as the processing of intermediate products sold by the reporting company. An example of this might be the emissions produced by a third party should the reporting company choose to outsource the processing of its intermediate products. Category 3 accounts for the emissions produced during the use of sold products, which can further be subdivided into two categories: the direct use phase and indirect use phase. This category would be better explained with an example other than potato chips. Direct use phase emissions refer to emissions produced from the use of the product, like the use of a computer, and the emissions associated with the amount of electricity consumed by it. Indirect use phase emissions refer to the emissions indirectly produced from the use of the product. For example, the emissions from electricity consumed by a washing machine required to wash dirty clothing, where the reporting company produces the clothing. Category 4 accounts for emissions from the end-of-life treatment of sold products, defined as emissions from the waste, disposal, and treatment of products sold by a company at the end of its life. An example would be the emissions arising from incineration plants, which are not under the control of the reporting company, which are used to dispose of potato chip wrappers. Category 5 accounts for emissions from downstream leased assets, which is defined as the emissions arising from the operation of assets owned by the reporting company, which are leased to other entities. An example would be the emissions from the use of cars that Avis, a car rental company, rents out. Category 6 accounts for emissions from the operation of franchises. An example of this might be the emissions arising from various franchise outlets of McDonald's all over the world, which should be reported under the franchisor's Scope 3 emissions. Lastly, Category 7 accounts for the emissions from the operations of investments, which include both equity and debt investments, as well as project finance. The emissions incurred from the investment from the reporting company in an electricity production project would be considered under the reporting company's Scope 3 Category 7 emissions. Finally, an important consideration when calculating emissions might be the allocation of emissions. The need to allocate emissions arises when a single facility produces multiple outputs, like a company that operates a factory that produces bottles for many soft drink brands. A reporting company which sources their bottles from this company would require to allocate their emissions, unless emissions specific to the bottles ordered by the reporting company can be provided. A hierarchy exists for the various allocation methods, and as a rule of thumb, physical factors should always be considered first. These include the mass or volume fractions of total output. If physical factors do not accurately represent the emissions, then economic factors should be applied, which entails using the economic value of a specific output as a fraction of the total economic value of outputs from a single facility. To conclude, there are some caveats associated to the information required to calculating emissions. Extrapolation of data is allowed if the process of getting all the required information is prohibitive or costly, which reporting companies might face when considering Scope 3 emissions. Proxy data can also be used in calculation when data of insufficient quality is not available. Proxy data can also be used in calculation when data of sufficient quality is not available. An example might be using the emission factors for Ukraine as a proxy for Moldova, when the emission factors for the latter are unavailable. Thank you very much for listening all the way through, and I hope you have benefited from this presentation. Thank you.